She cheated, lost her marriage, lost her daughter, and 14 years later returned only to demand what was never hers anymore. Olivia once believed she could divide her life into separate compartments and keep each one intact. But the moment she allowed herself to cross the boundary of her marriage, everything she thought was stable began to collapse in ways she never anticipated. At the time, she was a wife and a mother, living in a quiet household that looked functional from the outside, even if it felt suffocating to her from within. She told herself she deserved more excitement, more attention, more proof that she was still desirable beyond the predictable rhythm of family life. What began as emotional distance quickly turned into a physical affair, and the secrecy that followed slowly eroded the foundation of her home. When her husband discovered the truth, there was no dramatic confrontation or public spectacle, just a swift and irreversible breakdown of trust. The marriage ended cleanly on paper, but painfully in reality, and the consequences reached far beyond the divorce itself. Their daughter, still young enough to be shaped by the narrative around her, left with her father, who soon remarried a woman capable of offering stability without chaos. Olivia watched her child drift away, first emotionally and then physically, until communication stopped altogether. Her number was blocked, her attempts ignored, and eventually her existence faded from her daughter's daily life. The affair that once felt like an escape quickly revealed itself as temporary, and the man who had promised excitement vanished when responsibility replaced secrecy. Olivia was left alone to face the wreckage of her choices. Friends distanced themselves, family ties weakened, and the quiet house became a constant reminder of what she had lost. Over the years, she rebuilt her life in small, careful steps, working steadily and learning to survive without the identities she once relied on. The only thing that remained consistent was the home her mother had left her. Along with modest savings she guarded fiercely, it became more than property. It was proof that something in her life had endured when everything else had fallen apart. 14 years passed in silence, marked by birthdays missed and milestones she learned about only through fragments of information from others. Olivia stopped expecting reconciliation, convincing herself that acceptance was the closest she would come to peace. Then, without warning, the past resurfaced. Her daughter reappeared as an adult, no longer the child Olivia remembered, carrying herself with confidence shaped by a life lived without her. There was no warmth in the reunion, no attempt to revisit the years of absence. The visit was brief and purposeful, framed as an invitation to a wedding and accompanied by an expectation that Olivia would hand over the house and savings that had once belonged to her mother. It became clear almost immediately that this was not a return motivated by forgiveness or curiosity, but by entitlement. Olivia listened quietly, absorbing the reality that her daughter saw her less as a parent and more as an obstacle to assets she believed should belong to her. The moment crystallized everything Olivia had learned over the years. She understood that her past actions had shaped this outcome, but she also knew she had spent years preparing for the possibility that the wound she caused would return in unexpected forms. What her daughter did not realize was that Olivia had already made decisions long before this meeting, decisions designed to ensure that the last pieces of her life could not be claimed by those who had walked away. As she watched her daughter leave once more, Olivia felt neither rage nor despair, only a calm certainty that the reckoning she feared had finally arrived, and that she was no longer unprepared to face it. After her daughter left that day, Olivia did not immediately feel the devastation she once imagined such a meeting would bring. Instead, a quiet heaviness settled over her, not sharp or overwhelming, but steady and familiar, like an old ache she had learned to live with. She replayed the encounter repeatedly, not to search for what she might have said differently, but to understand how completely time had reshaped their relationship. 14 years of silence had not created distance. It had created replacement. Her daughter's life had been rebuilt around a different family structure, one that functioned without Olivia's presence, without her voice or influence. The woman who stood before her was not seeking connection, but closure of a financial nature, treating the past as a ledger that could be balanced with property and money. Olivia recognized that the entitlement did not come from cruelty alone, but from years of being told a simplified version of the truth, one where Olivia existed only as the source of pain, not as a flawed human who had lived with the consequences of her mistakes. In the weeks that followed, Olivia continued her routines unchanged, rising early, maintaining the house, and managing the modest finances she had built with discipline and restraint. The house her mother left her remained her anchor, each room filled with memories that reminded her why she had protected it so fiercely. It was not merely an inheritance. It was the last symbol of continuity in a life disrupted by her own decisions. Olivia understood that her daughter's request was not impulsive. It had likely been discussed, justified, and encouraged by others long before it reached her doorstep. The idea that she owed something beyond what she had already lost had been nurtured over time. Olivia felt no urge to defend herself or revisit the details of her betrayal. She accepted her role in the fracture of her family, but she refused to accept the notion that her existence should now be reduced to compensation. Her past affair had cost her dearly, but it had also forced her to confront accountability in ways her daughter had never been required to face. As days passed, Olivia noticed a shift within herself. The guilt that once defined her sense of identity no longer controlled her reactions. She had paid for her mistakes through years of isolation, regret, and self-reconstruction. She had not escaped consequence. She had lived inside it. The more she reflected, the clearer it became that her daughter's return was not a second chance, but a final test of boundaries. Olivia began reviewing the decisions she had made quietly over the years, the paperwork she had organized, the safeguards she had put in place precisely because she feared this moment. She had learned not to rely on emotional appeals or moral arguments. Instead, she relied on preparation. The house, the savings, the future she had protected were no longer vulnerable to sudden claims or emotional pressure. This realization brought her a sense of control she had not felt since before her marriage collapsed. Olivia did not celebrate this control, nor did she feel triumphant. She felt resolved. She understood now that reconciliation could not be forced and that love could not be reclaimed through obligation. Her daughter's absence had taught her that relationships broken by betrayal do not heal simply because time has passed. They require mutual willingness, and that willingness was absent. As Olivia continued her life, she accepted that her daughter might return again, not seeking understanding but leverage. And this time, Olivia would not be caught between guilt and fear. She would meet whatever came next with clarity, aware that her mistakes had shaped her path but would no longer dictate her future. As Olivia moved through the weeks following her daughter's unexpected return, she became increasingly aware of how deeply the past still influenced the present, not through emotion, but through consequence. The betrayal that ended her marriage had not stopped echoing when the divorce papers were signed. It had continued shaping every relationship that followed, including the one she no longer had with her child. Olivia understood now that her daughter's anger was not rooted solely in abandonment, but in the narrative that had grown in Olivia's absence, a narrative where her infidelity became the defining feature of her identity rather than one chapter in a much longer story of failure, loss, and accountability. She did not attempt to correct that narrative. Years earlier, she had learned that explanations offered too late often sound like excuses. Instead, she focused on what she could control, her actions in the present and the boundaries she was no longer willing to compromise. The calm she felt was not forgiveness of herself, but acceptance that the version of her daughter who might have wanted reconciliation no longer existed. Olivia noticed how memories resurfaced uninvited, moments from the years before the affair when her daughter was small and still reached for her instinctively. Those memories carried no comfort anymore, only reminders of how fragile trust truly was. She recognized that her decision to seek validation outside her marriage had not only broken her husband's trust but had reshaped her daughter's understanding of loyalty, stability, and family. In that sense, the damage was generational, extending beyond a single relationship. Olivia did not deny this truth. She carried it with her daily, allowing it to inform her decisions without paralyzing her. The request for inheritance lingered in her mind not as a threat, but as evidence of how transactional the bond between them had become. Her daughter did not ask how Olivia had survived the years alone, how she rebuilt herself after being rejected by nearly everyone she loved. She asked only what she stood to gain. That realization marked a turning point. Olivia stopped framing herself as someone waiting for forgiveness and began seeing herself as someone entitled to self-preservation. The house and savings represented years of discipline, restraint, and survival, not a prize to be distributed to ease someone else's resentment. Olivia reviewed her legal arrangements carefully, confirming what she already knew. Her assets were secure, structured in a way that reflected her intentions rather than anyone else's expectations. This preparation was not fueled by bitterness, but by clarity. She understood that guilt had once made her vulnerable to manipulation, and she refused to allow that vulnerability to resurface. Meanwhile, she learned through distant connections that her daughter's life had been stable, supported by a family unit that framed Olivia a cautionary example rather than a person. The knowledge stung briefly, but it also reinforced Olivia's understanding that she could not compete with a story told consistently for 14 years. The role she was assigned in that story was fixed, and she no longer wished to perform against it. As time passed, Olivia felt an unexpected sense of relief. The confrontation she had feared for so long had already occurred, and it had not destroyed her. Instead, it clarified her position. She was not a victim of circumstance, nor was she entitled to redemption through inheritance or obligation. She was simply a woman who had made a destructive choice, paid its cost, and chosen to live deliberately afterward. That clarity hardened into resolve as Olivia prepared herself for what she sensed would come next. She knew her daughter's request would not be the end of the matter. It was merely the opening move in a negotiation Olivia had anticipated for years. And this time, Olivia would not react from shame or longing. She would respond from a place of measured certainty, fully aware that protecting what she had rebuilt was not an act of cruelty, but an act of survival shaped by lessons learned the hardest way possible. The second contact came weeks later, delivered not with hesitation, but with confidence, as if time itself had softened the weight of the first encounter. Olivia recognized the shift immediately. The request was no longer framed as a tentative expectation, but as a logical next step, presented with the assumption that resistance would be futile. Her daughter's tone, conveyed through carefully chosen words, reflected a belief that biology and past suffering entitled her to claim what remained of Olivia's life. There was no acknowledgement of distance, no curiosity about Olivia's perspective, only a practical focus on assets, timelines, and outcomes. Olivia felt the final remnants of emotional uncertainty dissolve as she absorbed the message. She realized that her daughter's return had never been about reconciliation delayed by fear. It had been about timing, about waiting until adulthood granted confidence and leverage. The wedding invitation was not an olive branch, but a pretext, a socially acceptable opening for a conversation centered on inheritance. Olivia reflected on how easily love can be redefined when absence is filled by certainty offered elsewhere. Her daughter had grown up in a household where loyalty was reestablished quickly, where Olivia's betrayal was framed as the soul rupture, and where the new family narrative required a clear antagonist. That clarity had given her daughter stability, but it had also erased complexity. Olivia did not resent the life her daughter built. What she resented was the assumption that years of silence could be bridged with entitlement rather than understanding. She reviewed her plans one final time, not because she doubted them, but because she wanted to face the next step without hesitation. The decisions she had made long ago were precise, legally sound, and intentionally quiet. They were not reactive measures, but the result of years spent anticipating a moment when guilt would be tested against self-respect. Olivia understood that her daughter would likely interpret refusal as further proof of moral failure. She accepted that consequence without resistance. She had learned that being misunderstood was sometimes the price of integrity. As the date of the wedding approached, Olivia noticed a familiar pressure creeping in, not from external demands, but from internal echoes of who she once was. She remembered the version of herself who believed sacrifice could mend any wound, who thought giving more might earn forgiveness. That version had disappeared over time, replaced by someone who understood that generosity without consent was simply surrender. Olivia prepared her response with the same care she once applied to rebuilding her life. She did not intend to confront or accuse. She intended to state facts, boundaries, and finality. The past had taught her that emotional appeals would only reopen wounds that could never fully heal. She chose clarity over comfort. When the moment came, Olivia felt no tremor of doubt. She knew that whatever reaction followed would not change the truth she had lived with for 14 years. The house, the savings, the remnants of her mother's legacy were not symbols of punishment or reward. They were anchors of survival, and Olivia was no longer willing to let the consequences of one betrayal justify the loss of everything that came after it. The final exchange unfolded without raised voices or emotional spectacle, exactly as Olivia expected it would. By the time the wedding date approached, she had already accepted that her presence or absence would carry symbolic weight far beyond its actual importance. Her daughter viewed the event a marker of legitimacy, a public confirmation that her life had progressed cleanly and successfully after cutting ties with the past. Olivia understood that being invited was not an act of reconciliation, but a calculated gesture meant to frame her compliance, familial duty, rather than personal concession. When Olivia declined both the invitation and the demands attached to it, the response was immediate and revealing. Her daughter's disappointment surfaced not as grief or reflection, but as frustration that a long-assumed outcome had been denied. The inheritance, once spoken of as expectation, was now treated as entitlement unjustly withheld. Olivia listened carefully, absorbing the final proof that the distance between them could not be bridged by obligation or bloodline. She felt no anger in that moment, only a quiet confirmation that her instincts had been correct. The child she lost years ago had grown into someone shaped by narratives Olivia could not undo and values she did not share. After the exchange ended, Olivia experienced a sense of closure deeper than she anticipated. The confrontation she had prepared for over 14 years had arrived and passed without destroying her. Instead, it affirmed the transformation she had undergone. She was no longer the woman defined solely by her worst decision. She was someone who had lived with consequence, endured isolation, and rebuilt herself without seeking absolution from those who refused to see her fully. In the weeks that followed, Olivia continued her routines unchanged, tending to the house that had become her refuge and maintaining the financial stability she had preserved through discipline rather than luck. The home remained filled with quiet reminders of resilience rather than regret. She rearranged rooms, donated old belongings, and allowed herself to envision a future not constrained by fear of being found or judged. The past no longer waited in the corners of her life. It had taken its place behind her, acknowledged but no longer commanding attention. Olivia knew her daughter would likely interpret the outcome as another betrayal, another chapter reinforcing the story she had grown up believing. Olivia accepted that without resistance. She had learned that not every story allows for mutual understanding, and not every wound can be healed by sacrifice. Sometimes survival requires choosing oneself even when doing so cements another person's resentment. In quiet moments, Olivia reflected on the chain of events that led her here. She did not excuse her affair or minimize the damage it caused. She recognized it as the original fracture that set everything else in motion. But she also recognized that accountability did not require endless self-erasure. 14 years of solitude, rebuilding, and restraint had been her penance, and she refused to extend that punishment indefinitely to satisfy demands rooted in anger rather than healing. As seasons changed, Olivia's life settled into a rhythm defined by intention rather than reaction. She invested in community, built relationships grounded in honesty, and allowed herself a sense of peace she once believed was unattainable. The house and savings remained intact, not as trophies of defiance, but as symbols of endurance. They represented the life she saved after losing nearly everything else. Olivia did not know if her daughter would ever understand her decision, and she no longer needed that understanding to move forward. She had faced the reckoning she feared, stood firm without cruelty, and chosen a future shaped by clarity instead of guilt. And in doing so, she finally reclaimed ownership of a life that had been defined too long by a single betrayal rather than the long, difficult journey that followed it.